The sheriff locked the diner door, demanded a white envelope from the elderly waitress, and slapped her when she refused to let go. A coffee cup spun across the floor. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. Then the gray-haired biker in the last booth slowly lowered his coffee. The sheriff dismissed him as just another old man in a leather vest. That was his first mistake. Outside, motorcycle headlights began appearing through the rain, one after another. But the sheriff wasn't watching the windows. He was staring at the envelope in his hand, and whatever the waitress had hidden inside it. Rain pressed against the windows of the Hearthlight Diner in silver sheets when Sheriff Bram Vickery turned the lock on the front door. The click was small, almost ordinary, but Della Harrow heard what it meant. No customers could enter. No one could leave. Bram stood between her and the door with rain shining on the shoulders of his uniform. His deputy waited several steps behind him, silent and uneasy, while Tressa Lorne remained frozen beside the register. Bram held out his hand. The envelope. Della kept one palm flat against the counter. Beneath it lay a plain white envelope that seemed too small to frighten a man with a badge, a gun, and an entire county trained to obey him. I said, "Give it to me." When she did not move, Bram reached across the counter and seized her wrist. Della pulled back. The envelope slid several inches. Then Bram struck her. The slap snapped through the diner. A coffee cup spun across the floor. For 2 long seconds, there was nothing but the soft scrape of porcelain and Della's unsteady breathing. In the last booth, a gray-haired biker remained seated for one deliberate beat. He did not shout. He did not threaten the sheriff. He placed his cup on the table, took out his phone, and sent 3 words. Witnesses. No violence. Outside, the first motorcycle headlights appeared through the rain. Then another pair. Then another. Bram looked toward the windows, and for the first time that evening, the most feared man in the county appeared uncertain. He was not afraid of the biker alone. He was afraid of the envelope. If you believe a badge should protect ordinary people instead of frightening them, subscribe and stay with this story. Men like Bram Vickery survive by convincing good people to look away. But to understand why Bram suddenly looked nervous, we need to return to the beginning of that Friday. And to the 11 months of fear that had brought Della to that counter. 11 months earlier, the Hearthlight Diner had opened before sunrise, just as it had nearly every morning for the past 43 years. By 6, the coffee was fresh, the grill was hot, and Della Harrow was already moving between the booths with the easy rhythm of someone who knew the room better than she knew her own kitchen. She was 66 years old and had worked there for 22 years. A retired mechanic named Vernon always ordered 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and coffee filled only halfway, because he hated spilling it when his hands shook. Della placed the cup exactly where his right hand could reach it. And when a retired veteran named Hollis came in counting coins beneath the table, Della placed an extra biscuit beside his plate and said the kitchen had made too many. That was how kindness worked in the Hearthlight. It did not ask to be admired. It simply appeared where it was needed and moved on before anyone could feel ashamed. Near 9 that morning, a woman entered with a small boy and a canvas bag hanging from one shoulder. Her clothes were clean but rumpled, and exhaustion sat plainly across her face. Their car had broken down outside town. The repair shop could not look at it until afternoon. The boy had not eaten since the previous evening. The mother asked for 1 plate of toast. Della brought pancakes, eggs, fruit, and 2 glasses of milk. When the woman saw the bill, the total read 0. "I can't let you do that," she whispered. "You aren't," Della said. The cook made the wrong order. The diner had become more than a workplace to Della long before anyone noticed. It was where she had spent most of her adult life. She had celebrated birthdays behind that counter, served coffee after funerals, and watched children become parents who later brought in children of their own. She had fed people who could not always pay and pretended their meals had been covered by a customer who had already left. But warmth did not pay electric bills, and kindness did not stop the price of eggs, fuel, and insurance from climbing. Tressa Lorne, the diner's owner, had inherited the business from her parents. At 63, she worked 6 days a week and still took paperwork home every night. And on the final Friday of every month, she noticed Tressa count cash into an unmarked white envelope. That morning, Della entered the office carrying 2 mugs of coffee and found Tressa arranging bills into neat stacks. The amount was larger than the previous month. Della set the mugs down. "How much this time?" Tressa did not look up. "More than we can afford." Outside, a sheriff's patrol vehicle rolled slowly past the diner. It did not stop. It did not need to. Tressa watched it through the office window until it disappeared. The customers believed the envelope contained taxes, supplier money, or perhaps the diner's weekly deposit. Only 3 people in the building knew the truth. He had visited the diner after closing, taken off his hat, and spoken to Tressa in the careful, neighborly tone he used whenever he wanted something that could not be written down. Drug traffic had increased along the highway. Deputies were working longer shifts. Small businesses depended on visible patrols, and visible patrols required support. He called the money a public safety contribution, $500 each month. Cash only, no receipt. 3 days later, a county health inspector arrived without warning and claimed the diner's refrigerator was 2 degrees above regulation. The reading changed when checked with another thermometer, but that did not matter. The warning had already been filed. A week later, customers began receiving parking citations in spaces they had used for years. Then came an anonymous complaint alleging rats behind the kitchen. There were no rats. The inspector still ordered the back storage area closed until a formal review could be completed. The closure cost Tressa nearly a week of business. When she refused Bram again, one of her teenage dishwashers was stopped while walking home, searched, and taken to the station over a bottle of prescription medication bearing his mother's name. He was released without charges, but Bram made sure the story traveled through town before he was allowed to leave. The message was simple. Refuse, and problems appeared. Pay, and they disappeared. Other businesses learned the same lesson. Della could not accept it. "This is extortion," she said one evening after the final customer had left. Tressa kept wiping the same clean section of counter. "It's survival. It stops being survival when he decides what we're allowed to keep. And what happens when we report him? He gets investigated." Tressa gave a tired laugh. "By whom? His deputies? The county board that gives him awards? Half this town has his campaign sign in their garage." On the wall behind them hung a framed newspaper article showing Bram smiling beneath the headline "Sheriff Restores Order to Troubled County." The photograph had been taken at a press conference. Bram stood behind a row of seized weapons and spoke about courage, duty, and protecting families. The article called him decisive. It called him respected. It called him the reason crime had fallen. That same week, he had cornered Tressa beside the diner's back door and warned that if she missed another payment, he would accuse her of knowingly employing people connected to drug trafficking. Tressa looked at the framed article. 2 older women against a decorated sheriff, she said. Who do you think they'll believe? Della looked at Bram's smiling face. Power only works this way when everybody agrees not to see it. The following Saturday, Bram attended a charity dinner for injured officers. He wore a dark suit, posed beside donors, and accepted an award for public service. Cameras flashed as he spoke about trust between law enforcement and the community. He said a badge was a promise. Later that night, still wearing the same white shirt beneath his coat, he drove behind the Hearthlight Diner and collected an envelope from Tressa through the half-open back door. He counted the money before leaving. That was the evening she began writing everything down. At first, the records looked like ordinary notes in an old order pad. April 28th, $700. Back entrance. May 26th, $700. Threatened inspection. June 30th. Arrived at 9:12. No official call logged. She wrote the dates Bram visited, the amounts he demanded, and the words he used when he believed no one important was listening. She added the names of businesses cited after refusing him. She recorded which patrol cars appeared and whether dispatch had officially sent them. Whenever Tressa received a warning, citation, or inspection notice, Della copied the identifying numbers into the pad. She hid the pad beneath a loose drawer liner beside the register. Then she began making duplicates. The third she mailed to the State Inspector General's office without including her return address. For several weeks, nothing happened. Then a woman named Nola Quaid called the diner and asked for Della. Nola arrived in an ordinary sedan and dressed like someone who did not want to be remembered. She had read Della's notes. They were detailed, consistent, and troubling. But they were not enough. Dates could be challenged. Amounts could be dismissed as guesses. Threats written from memory could be called exaggerations. Nola needed Bram's voice, clearly stating what he wanted and what would happen if he did not receive it. "Can you get him to say the amount?" she asked. Della looked across the parking lot. Her hands were resting in her lap, but they had begun to shake. He doesn't like repeating himself. Then make him suspicious enough to explain, but not suspicious enough to leave. Della gave a small, humorless smile. That sounds simple when you say it. It isn't simple, Nola said. And it isn't safe. That honesty mattered. Nola did not call Della brave. She did not promise the plan could not fail. She explained the risks, the limits of the investigation, and the possibility that Bram might sense something was wrong. Then she placed a plain white envelope on the seat between them. Inside the cardboard base was a recorder smaller than a matchbox. The next monthly payment would be placed above it. If Della could make Bram state the amount and connect the payment to his threats, Nola would finally have evidence that could not be explained away as coincidence. Della touched the envelope, but did not pick it up. What happens after? If the recording is clear, we move. And if it isn't, we try again. Della imagined another month of Tress accounting bills she could not spare. Another month of Bram driving slowly past the diner. Another person searched, cited, closed, or humiliated because everyone had learned to survive by looking elsewhere. She took the envelope. Her hands were still shaking. That night, after the diner closed, Della stood alone behind the counter. She placed the white envelope in front of her. I don't have your money, she said. The words came out too softly. She tried again. I don't have. Her throat tightened. She looked toward the front door, imagining Bram standing there. The badge, the gun, the slow voice he used when he wanted fear to do most of the work. Della pressed both palms against the counter. I don't have your money. The third attempt was clear. She repeated it until she could say the sentence without looking away. 2 days later, Bram entered during the lunch rush while Della was copying the reference number from a county inspection notice into her old order pad. She did not hear him approach. His shadow reached the counter before his voice did. Keeping track of something? Della's pen stopped. Bram stood inches away. For one terrible second, she believed he knew everything. She closed the pad and turned it beneath her palm. Tips. Bram glanced toward the crowded booths. Must be doing well. Some days. He leaned closer. His eyes moved from her face to the order pad, then back again. Bram tapped the pad once with his finger. Make sure you report all of it. Then he smiled and walked away. Della waited until the door closed before breathing normally again. By the final Friday, the storm had settled over the county before dusk. Rainwater rushed along the gutters. Wind pushed against the diner windows, and customers arrived with wet shoulders and folded umbrellas. The monthly envelope waited beneath the register. Shortly after 6, a motorcycle pulled into the parking lot alone. The rider entered without ceremony. He was nearly 60, broad through the shoulders, with gray hair, a weathered face, and the quiet posture of a man who did not need to advertise his strength. A dark raincoat covered most of his leather vest. Only a small portion of the chapter markings showed when he moved. He paused inside the doorway and studied the diner. Not casually. He looked at the counter, the kitchen entrance, the hallway leading to the restrooms, and both exterior doors. Then he chose the last booth, where he could see the entire room. Della brought him coffee. Pie. What kind? Apple, pecan, and cherry. Apple. She returned with a generous slice and set it in front of him. The man looked at her name tag. Della Harrow. She glanced down as though she had forgotten she was wearing it. That's me. He studied her face for a moment longer than politeness required. Della waited for an explanation. None came. Coffee's fresh, she said. I know. There was something almost warm in his voice, but it carried a weight she could not place. As Della walked away, the man reached into his wallet and removed an old diner receipt, softened by years of folding. The ink had faded. The handwriting had not. Paid in full. Pass it on. He looked from the words to Della as she refilled Vernon's cup, carried a plate to the stranded mother and her son, and slipped an extra biscuit beside Hollis's meal. For several minutes, he did nothing but watch. Then he stepped outside beneath the awning and made a short phone call. I found her. He ended the call before the person on the other end could ask anything more. When he returned to the booth, the receipt disappeared into his wallet. Della never noticed it. The biker had waited more than 20 years to find Della Harrow. Bram Vickery chose that exact evening to make her his example. The sheriff arrived shortly before closing with Deputy Alden Firth behind him. The storm had darkened the road, and water ran from the brim of Bram's hat as he stepped inside. Several customers looked up. Bram gave them the practiced smile that had appeared in campaign photographs, charity events, and newspaper articles. County inspection, he announced. Nothing to worry about. We just need the room cleared for a few minutes. Tressa emerged from the office. There was no inspection scheduled. That's why they call it unannounced. His smile remained in place. The final customers gathered their coats and moved toward the exit. Bram held the door for them, offered a reassuring word, and waited until each person had stepped into the rain. He did not notice the biker in the rear booth. The lights above that section had been dimmed earlier in the evening, and the man remained still behind a cup of coffee gone cold. Bram turned the lock. Then he pulled down the blinds. Not all the way. One cord caught halfway across the front window, leaving a narrow opening toward the parking lot. Bram ignored it. Alden stood near the door with his hands at his sides. He was 31 and had worked beneath Bram for 3 years. He looked at Della, then at Tressa, then toward the floor. He already knew why they were there. Bram removed his hat and placed it on the counter. The envelope. Della felt the hidden recorder beneath the cardboard base. She placed her palm over it. You mean the $700 you demand every month? The room changed. Bram's expression did not collapse. It tightened. His eyes settled on Della. Why are you saying it like that? Like what? Like you need somebody to hear it. He looked toward the ceiling. The diner's obvious security camera hung above the register. Bram stepped beneath it and studied the small indicator light. It was dark. The camera had stopped working months earlier. Bram looked toward Alden. Check the back. Alden walked through the kitchen and returned. No one there. Bram scanned the booths. His gaze passed over the shadowed rear corner, but the biker had lowered his head slightly over his coffee, appearing to be an older traveler waiting out the storm. Bram turned back to Della. 700, he said quietly. And in return, this place continues operating without unnecessary trouble. Della kept her hand on the envelope. What happens if we don't pay? Bram smiled. You already know. I want to hear you say it. Alden looked up. Bram's smile vanished. He leaned both hands against the counter, bringing his face close to hers. I can have this diner closed before breakfast. I can send inspectors through every cabinet, every freezer, every employment record. And while we're being thorough, perhaps someone should speak to your grandson about that pharmacy burglary last month. Della's breath caught. Her grandson had nothing to do with the burglary. Bram knew that. That was why the threat worked. He did not need evidence. He needed a patrol car outside the boy's home, a public questioning, a rumor repeated often enough to become a stain. Alden shifted his weight. He saw Della's fear. He said nothing. Bram held out his hand. Give me the envelope. Della could feel the recorder beneath her palm and the tremor beginning in her fingers. She had practiced for 4 nights. She had imagined the badge, the gun, and Bram's slow, confident voice. She had told herself courage did not mean the fear would disappear. It meant the fear would be present when she answered. Bram extended his hand farther across the counter. Della had rehearsed her answer for 4 days. When the moment came, she needed only one word. No. The word was quiet. It did not sound heroic. It did not echo through the diner or rise above the storm. Della spoke it with one hand pressed against the counter and the other trembling beside the white envelope. But Bram heard it. Then he laughed. It was not the laughter of a man who found something amusing. It was the slow, disbelieving laugh of someone who had spent years mistaking obedience for respect and fear for loyalty. You think you can refuse me? Della kept her palm over the envelope. Bram leaned closer. You pour coffee for people who forget your name before they reach the highway. I run this county. No judge is going to believe you. No newspaper is going to print your version. And no jury is going to take the word of a waitress over the word of the sheriff. His voice remained low because he still believed he controlled the room. Della looked past him. Deputy Alden Firth stood near the locked door. His shoulders were rigid, and his eyes were fixed on the floor between them. But he heard you, Della said. Bram turned. Alden looked up. The briefest expression crossed his face. Not courage. Not yet. Only the fear of a man who had just been reminded that silence did not erase what he knew. Bram pointed toward the door. Outside. Alden hesitated. I said wait outside. Alden's hand moved toward the lock, then stopped. Sheriff. Now. The authority in Bram's voice had ended arguments for years. Alden unlocked the door, stepped into the rain, and pulled it closed behind him. Della watched him go. Bram faced her again. There. No deputy. No audience. No one to misunderstand what happens next. The man in the rear booth remained motionless, his face partly hidden by the shadows above the table. Bram held out his hand. The envelope. Della's fingers tightened. No. This time, there was no tremor in the word. Bram's expression hardened. He moved without warning, reaching across the counter and seizing the envelope beneath her palm. Della caught one edge before he could pull it away. Give it back. Bram yanked harder. The paper tore slightly along the corner. Della reached across the counter with her other hand. Then Bram struck her. The slap snapped through the diner with a sound sharper than the thunder outside. Della's shoulder hit the coffee station. A cup toppled from its saucer, bounced once, and spun across the tile. For 2 long seconds, there was no music, no shouting, and no movement. Della gripped the counter, fighting to remain upright. Tressa covered her mouth with both hands. Bram straightened the front of his uniform as though restoring order after a minor inconvenience. In the rear booth, the gray-haired biker slowly placed his coffee cup on the table. The cup stopped spinning. Della's breathing did not. Heat spread across her cheek. Her eyes watered from the force of the blow, but she refused to lower her face. Bram held the envelope against his chest. You did that to yourself. He believed everyone in the room understood the rules. Della would be ashamed. Tressa would be frightened. Alden would return when called and repeat whatever version Bram gave him. The stranger in the rear booth would decide that none of it was his concern. Bram believed everyone would pretend they had seen nothing. Comment: I saw it. If you believe silence only protects the person doing the harm. The gray-haired stranger rose. He did not push the table away. He did not clench his fists or rush the counter. He simply stood, buttoned the lower edge of his raincoat, and stepped into the light. Bram turned toward him. The stranger was taller than he had appeared while seated. Nearly 60, broad through the shoulders, and steady in a way that made movement around him seem hurried. Bram looked at the partially visible markings beneath the raincoat. You need to sit back down. The man continued walking. Bram shifted so the badge on his chest faced him directly. This is an active law enforcement matter. The stranger stopped several feet from the counter. Is that what you call it? Bram's jaw tightened. Name. The man looked first at Della. Blood had not broken the skin, but the outline of Bram's fingers was beginning to show across her cheek. Then he looked at the envelope. Roan Kessler. It meant something to Bram. Bram recovered quickly. You're a long way from your clubhouse, Mr. Kessler. Not as far as you are from your duty. Bram took one step forward. Careful. Roan did not move. Bram was accustomed to men reacting to the uniform before he had to make a threat. Some became respectful. Others became defensive. Nearly all of them adjusted themselves around his authority. Roan did neither. He looked past Bram to Della. Did he state the amount? Bram turned sharply. Della understood the question. She nodded. $700. And did he state what would happen if you refused? He said he would close the diner. He threatened my grandson. Bram raised the envelope. This woman attempted to bribe a county officer and then assaulted me when I confiscated the evidence. Tressa lowered her hands. That's a lie. Bram ignored her. Roan removed his phone. For a moment, Bram appeared to expect a weapon. Roan typed 3 words and sent them. Witnesses. No violence. Then he put the phone away. Outside, beyond the rain and the low rumble of thunder, an engine sounded on the highway. Then another. Bram heard them. His gaze shifted toward the narrow opening left by the damaged blind. Roan looked at Della. Do not let him open that envelope. Bram gave a short laugh, but the sound carried less confidence than before. You think bringing your gang here changes anything? I didn't say it changed anything. You are interfering with an arrest. No one is under arrest. I decide that. Roan's voice remained calm. That is the problem. The engines grew louder. Bram reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. Central, officer requesting immediate assistance at the Hearthlight Diner. Multiple armed gang members approaching. One officer threatened. Possible hostage situation. Roan waited until Bram released the button. There are no weapons in this diner except the one on your belt. Bram's hand moved instinctively toward his holster. Roan noticed. So did Della. Nothing in Roan's posture changed. He did not challenge the movement or place his own hands where Bram could misinterpret them. His authority came from how little he needed to prove. Keep your hands where I can see them, Bram ordered. They already are. The first motorcycles turned into the parking lot. Their headlights swept across the blinds, moving through the diner in bands of white light. Bram looked from Roan to the windows. For the first time that evening, he stopped looking at Roan and looked at the envelope in his own hand. The engine noise outside gave him another idea. If he could not control what had happened, He could control how it was described. Bram unlocked the diner door and shouted through the ring. "Alden!" Inside, the deputy returned, wet hair pressed against his forehead. "What's happening?" Bram pointed at Della. "She assaulted me while I was conducting an official investigation. This man interfered with the arrest and summoned armed associates to intimidate an officer." Alden looked at Della's reddened cheek. Then he looked at Bram's unmarked face. "Sheriff, handcuff her." Della stared at Alden. He did not move. Bram stepped closer. "That was an order." Alden's right hand hovered near the cuffs on his belt. Tressa came around the side of the counter. "She didn't touch him. He hit her." Bram pointed at her without looking away from Alden. Remained silent. "I made the payments," Tressa said. 11 of them. $700 every month. "You are interfering with a lawful investigation. You came after closing. You made me pay cash. Another word, and you will be detained." Roan raised his phone openly and began recording. "My name is Roan Kessler. I witnessed Sheriff Bram Vickery take an envelope from Della Harrow after threatening this diner and her family. I witnessed him strike her." He turned the phone toward Tressa. "State your name and what you witnessed." "Tressa Lorne. I own the Hearthlight Diner. Sheriff Vickery demanded monthly payments from me for 11 months. Tonight he threatened to close my business. Then he slapped Della." Bram stepped toward the phone. "Turn that off." Roan continued recording. "Deputy, state your name." Alden looked at the camera. Bram moved between them. "You do not answer him." Roan held the phone high enough to keep Bram in frame. "Alden Firth," the deputy said quietly. Bram turned on him. "What did you say?" Alden swallowed. "My name. I know your name." The engines outside multiplied. Headlights moved across every window now, but Bram kept his attention on Alden. "You work because I assigned you. You wear that uniform because I signed your evaluation. Every promotion you've been considered for, every preferred shift, every disciplinary report that did not make it into your permanent file came through my office." Alden's hand remained near his cuffs. Bram lowered his voice. "Decide whether you want a career when this night is over." The threat pulled Alden backward through 3 years of memory. He remembered the first time Bram ordered him to disable his body camera. They had been parked behind a hardware store after closing. Bram said the owner wanted privacy while discussing a security issue. Alden turned the camera off. Bram returned to the patrol vehicle with an envelope tucked inside his coat. Months later, Bram changed the report of a roadside arrest, removing the line where a detained man complained that cash had disappeared from his wallet. Alden noticed. Bram told him the man was a liar and the correction protected the department from a pointless accusation. Alden signed the revised report. Then came a restaurant inspection that had no connection to law enforcement, a patrol call that never went through dispatch, and another body camera ordered off. Each time, Alden told himself the compromise was small. Each time, the next one became easier, until he could no longer remember whether he was following Bram because he believed him or because admitting the truth would require admitting what he had helped hide. "Alden," Bram's voice pulled him back into the diner. The first motorcycles entered the parking lot, then the second row, then the third. They arrived without revving their engines or circling the building. Each rider pulled into a space, stopped, and waited for the next to settle beside him. 40 motorcycles filled the lot. The riders removed their helmets. They kept their hands visible. Several raised their phones and began recording through the diner windows. No one approached the door. No one reached beneath a vest or opened a saddlebag. Roan's instruction had traveled through the group before they arrived. Witnesses. No violence. The final engine shut off. Silence settled across the parking lot so completely that the rain against the metal awning sounded louder than the motorcycles had. Bram's requested deputies arrived seconds later in 2 patrol vehicles. They stepped out quickly, hands near their holsters, expecting the armed confrontation Bram had described over the radio. Instead, they found 40 bikers standing in the rain with empty hands and phone cameras pointed toward the diner. One deputy looked through the narrow opening in the blinds and saw Della's cheek. Another saw Bram holding the envelope. Neither entered immediately. Bram noticed their hesitation. He pulled the front blind cord, trying to close the remaining gap. Della moved before he could finish. She caught the cord. "Let go," Bram ordered. Della held it with both hands. Pain still burned across her face. Her knees felt weak, and the room seemed too small around her. But she did not release it. Bram pulled. Della pulled back. The blind remained open. Roan did not step in front of her or take the cord from her hands. He stood close enough to help if Bram touched her again, but he allowed the act of refusal to remain hers. Outside, dozens of cameras captured it. Bram looked through the opening at the riders and the deputies beyond them. Roan spoke from behind him. You wanted a room without witnesses. Now you have a parking lot full of them. Bram released the cord. The blind snapped upward several inches, exposing more of the diner. For years, Bram had relied on private rooms, quiet threats, and reports written after everyone else had gone home. Now the walls of the diner were made of glass, and public visibility was doing what force had never managed to do. It was making him careful. The balance of power had begun to change, but Bram still held the envelope. He looked down at it and felt the weight of the cash inside. Marked bills, he thought. Perhaps serial numbers photographed in advance. Possibly a clumsy attempt to frame him. He still believed the envelope contained nothing more dangerous than money. That mistake lasted another 30 seconds. Bram slid one finger beneath the damaged corner. Della released the blind and reached toward him. Don't open it. His eyes narrowed. Roan repeated the warning. Put it on the counter. Bram smiled. The fear in their voices convinced him the envelope contained their weakness rather than his own. He tore it open. A few folded bills dropped onto the counter. So did a thin cardboard insert. Bram picked it up, bent it between his fingers, and felt something hard hidden inside. He tore the cardboard apart. The recorder fell into his palm. For the first time since entering the diner, Bram stopped pretending not to understand. He looked at Della. You recorded me. Della's cheek was swollen now, but her eyes were steady. You recorded yourself. Bram looked toward the dead security camera, then toward Roan's phone, then back at the tiny device in his hand. His mind moved quickly. The amount. The threat against the diner. The mention of Della's grandson. All of it had been captured. He raised the recorder above the counter and smashed it down. Plastic broke. The battery separated from the casing. He struck it again. A small circuit board skidded across the floor and stopped beside the fallen coffee cup. Bram stared at the pieces. Then his confidence returned. It began as a breath, then a smile. That was evidence in an active investigation, he said. You planted an illegal recording device, attempted to entrap a law enforcement officer, and interfered with county business. Della looked at the broken recorder. Bram mistook her silence for defeat. He placed both hands on the counter and leaned toward her. There is no recording now. Della raised her eyes. That wasn't the only copy. The smile disappeared. Several hundred yards away, an ordinary sedan sat in the dark near the closed feed store. Nola Quaid was inside. The recorder hidden in the envelope had transmitted every word to a receiver on the passenger seat. The audio file had already been copied, time-stamped, and sent through a secured channel before Bram ever opened the cardboard. His demand for $700 had been captured. His threat to close the diner had been captured. His threat against Della's grandson had been captured. So had the slap, the false radio report, and his attempt to destroy the device. Bram could break the recorder. He could not reach what it had already sent. Tressa moved toward the office. Bram stepped into her path. Where are you going? She stopped. Roan angled his phone toward them. Tressa looked at Della. Della nodded. Tressa entered the office and returned with an old order pad sealed inside a clear plastic bag. Bram recognized it. His eyes moved immediately to Della. The pad contained dates, payment amounts, citation numbers, threats, and the names of businesses visited after refusing him. 11 months of records. Della had made copies of every page. One set was no longer in the diner. Tressa placed the pad on the counter beside the torn envelope. Bram looked at the handwriting. For months, he had seen Della using that pad and believed she was counting tips. Della touched her swollen cheek. Power only works this way when everybody agrees not to see it. Outside, 40 phones remained pointed through the windows. Inside, Roan's camera remained fixed on Bram. Della looked directly at the sheriff. Tonight, they saw you. The recording proved what Bram had done that evening. It did not yet prove the 3 years that had come before it. That evidence belonged to the last person anyone expected. Bram turned toward Alden. Arrest them. Alden did not respond. Della Harrow for assault, obstruction, and unlawful recording. Tressa Lorne for conspiracy. Roan Kessler for intimidation and interference. Alden's fingers touched the cuffs on his belt. Then his hand moved away. Bram stepped toward him. Do your job. Alden looked at Della. Her earlier words returned to him. But he heard you. Bram pointed toward the counter. Take them into custody. Alden reached to the center of his uniform. Instead of activating his radio, he pressed the control on his body camera. A small light appeared. Yes, Alden said. Bram frowned. Alden looked first at Della, then into Roan's phone. Yes, I heard all of it. Bram stared at him. You need to think very carefully about what you say next. I have been. Alden's voice shook, but he continued. I preserve copies of patrol logs that were altered after unofficial business visits. I have the original dispatch records for calls that were added after the fact. I copied inspection dates that had no law enforcement purpose. Bram moved closer. Stop talking. Alden raised one hand. I saved audio of you ordering deputies to disable their body cameras before collecting payments. The uncertainty outside began to change. The arriving deputies looked at one another. Bram lowered his voice. You are confused. I signed reports I knew were false. The admission cost Alden more than the accusations. His face tightened as he said it. I told myself I was following orders. I told myself the changes didn't matter. They mattered. Bram looked toward the door, calculating whether the other deputies could still be controlled. Alden continued before he could speak. I have copies of payment records linking you to County Commissioner Orsonvale. Transfers made 2 days after collections from local businesses. I have photographs of the ledger in your office and recordings of you discussing which businesses needed pressure. Bram's face emptied. That was the first accusation he could not immediately explain. Tressa stared at Alden. Della understood before Bram spoke. You contacted the state, she said. Alden nodded. Weeks ago. Why didn't you come forward? His eyes lowered. Because I was afraid. He did not dress the answer in noble language. He did not claim he had been waiting for the perfect moment. I was afraid of losing my job. I was afraid of being charged for the reports I signed. And I was afraid no one would testify if I was the only person speaking. Alden looked at the broken recorder. Then she refused him. He looked through the window at the riders standing in the rain, and he made sure no one could pretend it happened in private. Roan did not accept the praise. This was her decision. Alden looked at Della again. She had not stopped being afraid. Her cheek still burned. Her hand still trembled when she released the blind cord. But she had answered Bram while fear was present. That was what made Alden's own silence impossible to excuse. Bram pointed toward the body camera. Turn it off. Alden stood straighter. No. The word moved through the diner differently this time. Della had spoken it first from behind a counter, alone except for people who were too frightened or uncertain to act. Now Alden spoke it while wearing the uniform Bram had used to control him. Bram's system had not been defeated by someone stronger. It was collapsing because the people inside it had begun withdrawing their obedience. Bram looked around the diner. Della stood beside the evidence. Tressa stood beside Della. Roan's phone was still recording. Alden's body camera was active. Outside, 40 witnesses remained silent. The arriving deputies no longer looked toward Bram for instructions. For 3 years, Alden had followed every order Bram gave him. Now he had broken rank in front of everyone. Bram had lost the waitress, the witnesses, and his deputy. But he still had his badge, his weapon, and one final chance to frighten everyone back into silence. Bram stared at Alden as though the deputy had committed an offense more serious than anything already exposed inside the diner. You planned this. Alden did not look away. You contacted the state. You copied my records. You brought these people here. No, Alden said. You brought us here. Bram moved toward him and reached for the body camera glowing at the center of Alden's uniform. Roan stepped between them. He did not shove Bram. He did not raise his hands. He simply placed himself in the space the sheriff intended to cross. Bram stopped. Move. Roan remained still. You are obstructing an officer. You are trying to destroy evidence. Bram's hand dropped toward his holster. Outside, the riders saw the movement. Several stepped forward through the rain. Roan raised one hand without turning around. Every rider stopped. The obedience was immediate. 40 men and women stood beneath the diner lights with empty hands visible, their phones still recording. Bram drew his service weapon. He pointed it at Roan's chest. The room became very quiet. Della could hear rain dripping from Alden's sleeve. She could hear Tressa breathing behind her. She could hear the faint mechanical hum of the refrigerator beneath the counter. Roan looked at the gun, then at Bram. They are watching you decide what kind of man wears that badge. Bram tightened his grip. Get on your knees. No. The answer came without anger. Bram took one step closer. I said kneel. And I said no. Roan's voice remained calm enough to make Bram's shouting sound desperate. Della looked at the weapon. Fear pressed against her ribs. Her cheek throbbed where Bram had struck her, and every instinct told her to remain behind the counter. Instead, she stepped out. Roan glanced toward her, but did not tell her to return. Della walked until she stood beside him. Bram stared at her. You think standing there changes what you are? Della's hands trembled. No, she said. It shows what you are. Alden moved next. He stepped away from the door and stood beside Della, keeping his body camera pointed toward Bram. Tressa hesitated only a moment before joining them. For people now faced the sheriff. None carried a weapon. None threatened him. None obeyed. Outside, 40 riders remained motionless because Roan had asked them to witness rather than attack. Bram moved the gun from Roan to Alden, then toward Della, unable to decide which refusal offended him most. The badge on his chest no longer commanded the room. It only made the weapon in his hand more terrible. Then someone knocked 3 times on the locked diner door. Bram's face changed. He knew who had arrived. Nola Quaid stood outside beneath the awning with 4 state officers behind her. One held a folder protected from the rain. Another kept his hands visible and away from his weapon. Nola looked through the glass at Bram. Sheriff Vickery, unlock the door. Bram did not move. Nola knocked again. We have a warrant. Bram glanced at the deputies in the parking lot. Secure the state officers, he shouted. They are interfering with a county operation. No one obeyed. The deputies looked toward Alden's active body camera, Roan's phone, the riders recording through the windows, and Della standing beside the torn envelope. Nola spoke through the glass. Put the weapon on the floor. This is my jurisdiction. Not tonight. Bram pointed the gun toward the door. You have no authority to enter. Nola raised the folder. The warrant is based on Deputy Firth's records, the transmitted audio from this diner, and evidence of attempted destruction. Put the weapon down. For several seconds, Bram remained caught between the man he had pretended to be and the man everyone could now see. He looked at Alden. The body camera light remained on. He looked at Roan. The phone remained steady. He looked outside. Dozens of screens were pointed toward him. He looked at Della. She stood beside the evidence with the mark of his hand across her face. Then he looked at his own deputies. Not one moved to defend him. Bram's arm began to lower. The gun reached his side. On the floor, Nola said. He bent slowly and placed it on the tile. Alden unlocked the door. State officers entered, secured the weapon, and moved Bram away from the counter. He tried to speak over them, demanding names and threatening careers, but his voice no longer changed anyone's actions. Nola stood before him. Bram Vickery, you are being detained pending charges related to extortion, evidence tampering, official misconduct, and civil rights violations. You have nothing. Nola looked toward the broken recorder. We have enough to begin. Her hand moved to the badge pinned above his pocket. Bram stiffened. For years, that badge had opened doors, ended questions, and transformed threats into official business. Nola removed it slowly. The small metal shield left 2 empty holes in the fabric. Only then did another officer place the handcuffs around Bram's wrists. No one cheered. For Della, the moment did not feel victorious. It felt strange and unfinished. The sheriff who had controlled the town was suddenly a tired man in a uniform, standing without his weapon while officers directed him toward the door. She had imagined justice as something louder. Instead, it arrived through paperwork, recorded words, witnesses, and people refusing to step aside. Tressa rested a hand against Della's back. Alden lowered his eyes, unable to celebrate a consequence that exposed his own failures. Roan remained still, watching Bram leave without triumph or insult. The riders outside opened a corridor through the rain. Bram walked between them and heard nothing but boots on pavement, handcuffs shifting behind him, and every camera preserving what fear could no longer erase. Della did not smile. The release came as exhaustion rather than celebration. Her knees weakened, and Tressa caught her arm. An arrest was not the same as justice. The investigation would take months. Attorneys would challenge recordings, records, and witness statements. Bram's allies would call the case political. Some residents would defend him because accepting the truth meant admitting how long they had ignored it. But the silence had broken. If you believe authorities should never place anyone above accountability, tap like. Bram counted on people respecting his title more than the truth. After Bram was taken outside, the riders stepped back to clear a path. No one touched him. No one shouted a threat. Roan watched until the patrol vehicle disappeared into the rain. Della believed he had simply been a stranger who refused to look away. She still did not understand why he had come to the diner alone. When the statements were finished and the state officers began leaving, Roan returned to the rear booth. He reached into his wallet and removed the old receipt. The paper had softened along every fold. The diner's name was barely visible, but Della's handwriting remained. Paid in full. Pass it on. Roan placed it on the counter beside the damaged coffee cup. Do you remember a young writer named Everett Kessler? Della studied the name. I'm sorry. I don't. He was my younger brother. 23 years earlier, Everett had lost control of his motorcycle on the highway outside town. He struck the gravel shoulder and landed in a drainage ditch with a broken leg and internal bleeding. Cars passed him. Some drivers did not see him. Others saw the leather vest, the tattoos, and the motorcycle twisted beside the road, then chose not to stop. Della had been driving home after a double shift. She stopped. She climbed into the ditch, called for help, and remained beside Everett until the ambulance arrived. At the hospital, she waited because he had no family nearby. When Everett was discharged the following afternoon, Della brought him to the hearthlight and bought him a meal. He attempted to repay her. She refused. On the receipt, she wrote 4 words. Paid in full. Pass it on. Everett kept the receipt for the rest of his life. After his death, Roan found it among the few personal things his brother had preserved through every move, every difficult year, and every mile on the road. Roan spent months identifying the diner and the waitress whose name appeared at the bottom. He had come that evening only to thank her. Instead, he watched Bram strike her. Della picked up the receipt carefully. I wish I remembered him. Roan looked toward the counter where she had fed the stranded child that morning. That is why he remembered you. She had helped too many people to preserve each act as something extraordinary. Kindness was not a transaction she recorded. It was simply what she did when someone needed help. Roan placed the receipt beside the cracked cup. For a moment, no one spoke. Della had once helped one frightened rider when nobody else stopped. 23 years later, an entire parking lot had stopped for her. The investigation that followed spread beyond the Hearthlight Diner. Business owners who had remained silent began bringing forward receipts, citations, messages, and bank records. Several testified that Bram had threatened closures, arrests, and public humiliation when they refused to pay. Bram was suspended immediately. Months later, he was convicted on charges involving corruption, extortion, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations. The process was slow and difficult, but it was no longer hidden. Alden accepted responsibility for the false reports he had signed. He cooperated fully, surrendered records, and testified about the orders he had followed. His decision did not erase his earlier complicity, but it prevented that complicity from continuing. The community rallied around Tressa. Customers filled the diner, paid for suspended meals, and contributed enough to repair the kitchen and cover overdue bills. The Hearthlight remained open. Roan's chapter began an annual breakfast ride supporting waitresses, cooks, cleaners, and other service workers facing hardship. Riders paid for meals, left generous tips, and carried cards printed with Everett's 4 words. The damaged coffee cup remained behind the counter. Della refused to throw it away. Months later, Roan returned and took the same rear booth. Della brought him coffee and apple pie. When he reached for his wallet, she shook her head. This one is on me. Roan placed the old receipt on the counter. No, ma'am. This one was paid for a long time ago. Bram believed power came from a badge, a weapon, and everyone else's fear. Della proved that real power begins the moment one person refuses to look away and another person chooses to stand beside them. Comment: I stand with Della. If you believe kindness should be repaid and cruelty should never be protected by a title. Share this story with someone who still believes ordinary people can stand together against abuse of power. And subscribe for more stories about the moments when courage appears where nobody expects it.